Hi, my name is Leah Benson and I am the Archivist for the National Gallery of Ireland. Today, we just wanted to share some of our George Bernard Shaw stories with you in the context of an exhibition that is currently up in room 11 in the gallery, which looks at Shaw and his relationship to the gallery, a place that he saw as a priceless part of his education. One of the reasons for marking Shaw and the relationship with the gallery is the fact that when he died in 1950, he left 1/3 of his royalties to the National Gallery of Ireland to do with as they wished. And this money has primarily been used for the purchases of works of art, but also used for the refurbishment of our beautiful historic wings. So it seems fitting to mark Shaw and this incredible gift to the gallery, which really resulted in being many millions of pounds and now euros to benefit the National Art Collection. What we wanted to look at today was just what Shaw's experience of the National Gallery would have been. So he spent the first 20 years of his life in Ireland, and after that, the remainder of his very long 94-year life in England. So a small portion of his life was spent in Ireland, but it was very influential. And I think it gave him much of the values and interests that he carried with him through the rest of his life. So we were interested to think about what he would have experienced in the National Gallery as a boy. So just looking at Shaw as a young boy, he grew up, was born into 33 Synge Street. In fact, when he was born there, it was 3 Synge Street, or 3 Upper Synge Street, and Upper, Middle and Lower Synge Streets were merged. And Shaw actually remembered while he was there it becoming 33 Synge Street. But this is a lovely Flora Mitchell sketch of the birthplace of George Bernard Shaw. His mother was Lucinda Elizabeth Gurley and his father was George Carr Shaw, and they were a somewhat mismatched couple. She was from a very wealthy family. It's thought that she married to escape a very dominant aunt. And George Carr Shaw unfortunately had a problem with alcohol, and this really resulted in the family drifting into sort of a shabby, genteel poverty, which Shaw was brought up in. His mother had a really beautiful singing voice, and she took lessons from a gentleman called George Vandeleur Lee, who was a singing teacher and a prominent figure in the theatre circles. And a kind of an unusual relationship developed, and in 1962 they all moved to a larger house in Hatch Street, and George Vandeleur Lee moved in with them, and his rent contributed to the cost of the larger home. You could say that Shaw was somewhat neglected as a child. He had an erratic education. He was in and out of different schools. And I think you can look back and see that some of his feelings about society and inequity, and in fact, his need to leave Dublin might have come from his experiences at school. In one instance, he was a Protestant boy in a Catholic school and would have experienced quite a lot of discrimination in relation to that. So you can see as a boy, his life experiences shaping the man that he would have become in later years. So we have this letter in our archives, which is actually on display in the exhibition at the moment. And in this, he talks about frequenting the gallery as a boy. And this is where we get the title of the exhibition, that it gave him a priceless part of his education. So he would have wandered the rooms of the National Gallery. And he also refers to Dalkey Hill as giving him another priceless part of his education. Vandeleur Lee had a cottage there, and he spent, George Shaw spent a lot of time there as a boy. So when we look back at the gallery in the 1860s, which is probably the decade he would have been here, he was born in 1856, and he left for London in 1873. So, you know, the 1860s probably would have been the main years he spent in the gallery. And we can see from this letter to the Irish Times that indeed children were very much present in the institution. This is somebody writing in, giving out basically about young boys and children, of whom there were many, and who, not being under the superintendence of grown people, amused themselves tramping on the ornamental grass in front of the building and running in among and touching the statuary. So we can only imagine that George Bernard Shaw could have been one of these boys running around the National Gallery and disturbing the great and the good who are there to look at the art. So we don't have a photograph of what the gallery looked like back in the 1860s, but this is a photograph of the Natural History Museum, and the two buildings were built to mirror each other. So this is more or less the opposite, but what the gallery would have looked like. So a very long elevation and a narrower front-facing element. And then this is a Jeremy Williams sketch of the gallery. So you can see it's just the Dargan wing. It's very different from what you see today with the additions of the Milltown and the Bight wing and the Millennium wing around the corner. So a much smaller space, but nonetheless, you know, it's seen as very grand and a very beautiful place and fitting for the National Art Collection. At the time, you'd have seen we would have had Corinthian columns, and the entablature at the top of the columns was designed with this shamrock motif, and in some instances Irish harp motifs with the sort of a surrounding wreath. Shaw himself was very fond of the shamrock emblem, and another story that we tell in the exhibition is of the relationship between Patrick O'Reilly, a Dublin dustman who was a one-man crusader for the recognition of George Bernard Shaw as being a great Irish literary figure. And Shaw and O'Reilly developed a very unlikely friendship after O'Reilly sent him a golden shamrock for his 90th birthday. And then a series of correspondence followed after that. And actually O'Reilly went and spent a 3-day visit with Shaw in his home in England. And as I said, these archives are now in the National Gallery and on display in the exhibition, but just another sort of side story about Shaw and his relationship with Dublin. So this is what you know as the Shaw Room, and you can see that it's filled with the statues that gentleman was so concerned about in his Irish Times letter. These are plaster casts, they're not real, and they're copies of Greek and Roman statues and also of the works of Michelangelo. And they were there for the purposes of teaching, so teaching students. The gallery had very much a teaching role at that time and would have welcomed students in to draw and sketch and study the works in the collection and take these away with them. And you can see at the top, just want to point out, is this would have been the gas lighting system that was in place in the gallery, which was actually very modern at the time. And interestingly, when we were refurbishing the Dargan wing, we were very careful to retain anything that told us something about the history of the building and the institution. And this is probably the last piece of that gas lighting equipment that you saw in the last photograph, which we kept in our object archive collection. So it's a lovely thing to have. This is an image of Richard Thomas Moynihan copying a cast at the National Gallery, and this speaks to the teaching role that the gallery felt it had. And I think it's interesting to look at I suppose, the ethos of the institution and the vision behind it. An awful lot of debate took place during the work to establish a National Gallery, thinking about what it would be. So was this art for the great and the good, or was this something that would really benefit citizens and society? And the gallery very much went with the idea of the benefit of culture and of art and of beauty to society as a whole. We were one of the first institutions in Europe to open on a Sunday, which allowed people of the then known operative classes to attend, as most people would have worked 6 days a week and Sunday would have been their only day off. It was free and still remains free, and that's hugely important. You know, a child like George Bernard Shaw never would have been able to pay a fee to enter an institution like this. So you can see sort of the benefits to the minds and the souls of people to have an institution openly available that will show them such a wonderful art collection. And you can imagine Shaw being one of the little boys, you know, watching the artists studying and working in the rooms in the gallery. And then this is just another angle of the Shaw Room as it would have looked in the time of George Bernard Shaw. So the walls would have been a sort of a silver grey colour, and there would have been drapes on the windows, you can imagine, and then different forms of wallpaper in the upper rooms. So just to think about what would have been on the walls when Shaw was in the gallery as a boy. When the gallery opened up, we only had 130 plus pictures in our collection, not a huge amount. Some of them came from London, some of them were given as gifts, some of them purchased through a fund that was raised by the Irish Institution, a group that formed itself to actually establish the National Gallery in Ireland. But these works were in the collection at the time when Shaw would have been in the rooms. So you can see he would have seen the opening of the Sixth Seal and the Supper at Emmaus and Solomon and the Queen of Sheba and the beautiful parakeets. So there were some really fine works of art on the walls at the time. In terms of how the hang would have looked, this is a slightly later period, but it wouldn't be dissimilar to this. They had what was a tiered hang. And so with limited storage space, pretty much as much of the collection that would go on display, that could go on display. And this is where you look at the whole idea of hanging on the line. And so the lower pictures would have been the ones that would perhaps have been more valued, because they're at eye level and people can see them more clearly. And then the lesser pictures hung higher up where you have to strain and stretch to look at them. But it would have been a very interesting and quite cluttered feel, but definitely a very different look from the gallery that you see today. And it was in about the 1930s that you see the move away from the tiered hang, and people start hanging single pictures on the line, which was seen as a much kind of cleaner, crisper way to appreciate the art on the walls. And again, this is the Grand Gallery upstairs, and you can see that there was this really lovely wallpaper in the galleries, and we were able to retain small fragments of this during the refurbishment process. And this is what the gallery looks like today. So you can see dramatically different showroom than previous years, when our George Bernard Shaw would have wandered the rooms. But I mean, this room is incredibly beautiful and incredibly special, and it's not by chance it's called the Shaw Room. And it's just another indicator of the amazing gift he gave to us, as some of his Shaw funds would have been used in the refurbishment of our historic wings. And that's it. So it's just a quick whistle-stop tour through thinking about what George Bernard Shaw would have seen in the National Gallery as a boy. As he said, he left Ireland at the age of 20 and never lived here again. But at the age of 94, he died in 1950. Obviously, the National Gallery was very much still on his mind, enough indeed to leave us a remarkable gift of 1/3 of his royalties. And if you are free to do it, we look forward to welcoming you into the exhibition sometime soon.